get started here. We don't want to start too late because we've got a really exciting and action-packed evening for you all today. Thanks for joining us. My name is Katie Grishak, and just a reminder, or rather something to let you know, that we will be recording this event this evening, and we'll be putting that on YouTube. So you don't have to take too close of notes. You'll be able to watch again. And if you know someone who wasn't able to make it tonight, they will be able to view it later. My name is Katie Grishak, and I work at the Grand Traverse Conservation District. And I'm joined here today by a couple of great experts. I'm going to give you a really short overview of the Grand Traverse Conservation District, just to get you familiar. And then we'll move on to the main event, of course, stewarding your trees. So the Grand Traverse Conservation District, located at the Boardman River Nature Center on Cass Road, just south of South Airport in Traverse City, is actually a really fantastic host of service-oriented conservation efforts. And so we, of course, have the Boardman River Nature Center, where people of all ages can come to learn more, whether it's walking in the gardens or hitting the trails, or once our nature center is open again, coming to visit our nature center. We have lots of programs for all ages. Right now, they're doing a lot of work with kids stuff. We also work with agriculture, which is kind of the root of conservation districts, if you will, through both the Michigan Agriculture Environmental Assurance Program, which is MEAP, and of course the Michigan On-Farm Produce Safety Program, working with growers to follow best practices and grow us some great stuff. We also work with Cameron Ross with the Michigan Forestry Assistance Program, and work through the Boardman River program to help steward the Boardman River. We manage a lot of parklands, 3,000 acres of parklands in Grand Traverse County, and work with the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network. The Grand Traverse Conservation District is the fiduciary agent for that 4-county collaborative effort on invasive species. You can get involved with the district by volunteering with us, sharing the messages, sharing the information, getting involved with our programs, stewarding trails, donating to us, and of course, planting trees and being a part of stewarding on your own land. We're here to answer your questions and be a resource for you. So please always feel free to reach out. So today we're going to talk seedlings and trees and shrubs all night long. We're going to start out with Cameron Ross talking about strategies for trees and seedlings, move on to Reb Ratliff, sorry, we've worked together for like 8 years, but apparently I can't say his name. And he's going to talk to you about Seedling Care. We're going to hear from Maddie Baroli, who will talk with us about the Assisted Tree Range Expansion Project. And then I'll talk to you a little bit more about our seedling sale in particular. After that, we'll have question and answer session with all speakers. So we'll hold all of our questions till the end. And with that, Kama, I would love for you to get started. I will stop sharing and you can go ahead and start.
Good evening, everyone. Let me share my screen here. The beginning. Okay. Yes, Cameron Ross. I serve as your district forester. I also serve for Leelanau and the Benzie Conservation Districts. I am one of 20 conservation district foresters that cover over 50 counties in the state of Michigan, mainly in the northern lower and the upper peninsula of Michigan. And it's called the Michigan Forestry Assistance Program, with our goal is to provide education, provide education and encourage forest landowners to take the next step, which is actively managing your woodlands. So if you happen to be a lucky forest landowner and you would like some assistance, this is what you might want to find out about me. If you don't happen to be one of those fortunate forest landowners in the area, but you might have a family member or a friend or a neighbor who does, I'd appreciate your sharing our program with them, because we're free. And how awesome is that, is what in this day and age, to have somebody, a technical person, come to your site, talk about trees and forest concerns at no charge. So your tax dollars through the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development are providing this service to forest landowners in those 50 counties of Michigan. I technically don't have a minimum acreage, but I do like to remind people that I'm a forester. And so a forester is someone who tends the forest. So if you really just have a couple of trees in your backyard and you have some concerns, I really would like to say that a certified arborist or a professional tree service company would be the better person to provide service for you. You're welcome to give me a call, send me pictures on the phone, or email me a concern. But for site visits, I really have to go to a forest because then I'm more comfortable. So, and some of the things I like to talk about with landowners are insect and disease concerns, which are multiplying as the years go on, at least I'm seeing throughout the years. Tonight, we'll be talking about those planting recommendations. We can talk about that year round, but right now we're gearing up, really intense. And if I can help you, my role as the district forester is to help you connect with the natural resource professional that really offers the services you are seeking. So, there might be something that you in the natural resources field and you're not sure who to call, please do call the conservation district, and you can call me as the district forester, and I will certainly help you find the right person if I'm not that person. And we do provide educational opportunities throughout the year. So, and hopefully those are going to be face-to-face pretty soon. So the Forestry Assistance Program, your tax dollars at work. Please get a hold of me if you think I might be of help to you or your family. This is my favorite quote and a perfect way to start the evening talking about trees. And obviously it's something that we all think we should do, but it is definitely, if you haven't planted trees for many, many years, start now, and that's the second best time. So we're going to talk about specific trees and shrubs that you can plant every year, spring, summer, and fall. And mainly what we're going to talk about tonight is how having a goal and some technical information under your belt before you place your order and get those trees in the ground is really going to be key for you to be successful. So tonight we're mainly talking about the bare root seedlings that the conservation districts offer. So those are conifers, hardwood trees, and shrubs. So I like to say that planting a tree is something that we should have done 20 years ago, but if you're doing it this year, get out and enjoy with family and friends safely, because there is no age requirement or high degree of technical ability needed to properly plant a tree. And after tonight, I think you'll feel a lot more confident. But get your grandkids out there, or your siblings or your neighbors, and get out and plant trees together. So we're kind of going to talk about areas that we can change, enhance for so many different reasons. We tend to call these areas that are fallow or unproductive, and that we just know that we could do more with native species. So in this picture, if you happen to be a riparian landowner along one of our beautiful inland lakes, you can turn a mowed grass area that's a monoculture into something lush and very productive for wildlife and so many parts of the ecosystem, protecting the water quality. So we're going to think about what species might be appropriate for that lakefront or streamfront riparian area that you might be steward of. So many landowners that maybe do have a little bit of acreage have open fallow fields and maybe some trees or some woodlot areas. And the picture on the left shows a typical sugar maple next to a open fallow field, and on the right side you'll see an autumn olive. So what we want to help landowners figure out is how to take that situation and really enhance it. And one thing that we really like to do is add conifers, add hardwoods, add smaller trees and shrubs to feather an edge and create a really diverse, structured woodlot edge that's going to be really beneficial for a lot of different species of wildlife, from insects all the way up to mammals. So that's another way that we can use the bare root seedlings that we're going to be talking about tonight to feather edges and really increase the bang for your buck if you have a field that looks like this. So many people I visit have woodlots that are really seeing some consequences from some of the non-native insects and disease that are coming. Right now, I think the biggest one that we're all facing is beech bark disease. It is unfortunate, but the American beech probably will not survive very well with this non-native insect. It's going to take out the vast majority of our magnificent beech, and when those beech come down, you know, they have huge canopies, huge amount of branches, so they leave holes in the understory. I like to say that there's always a good point to something bad, like a non-native insect coming to your woodlot. So now your woodlot has sunlight hitting the forest floor, and see that as an opportunity to introduce some trees and shrubs that are native to Michigan, can grow well on that site, but because of the limit of sunlight hitting it, they wouldn't do well. So underplanting with white pine or some shrubs that can do a little, can fruit and flower in the understory. It's a great place to add diversity to your woodlot. And again, taking a bad thing, a loss of a magnificent tree, and turning it into a positive for overall health and sustainability of your woodlot. And I think so many of us might have a little bit too much grass to mow, especially by mid to late summer. You're thinking, what the heck? So, you know, think about changing some of the lawn and turning it into more diverse habitat. And some of the shrubs and trees that we're going to talk about today can really enhance a yard and make it less grass for you to mow. And just think about the pollinators, how happy they will be, the songbirds too. So that's just a little overview of what kind of gets me excited when I think about talking to people about planting trees and shrubs. But mostly as a forester, I like to talk about the specifics of matching the species to the site. So there is a right species for the right place for the right reason. And it takes a little bit of work on your part as the landowner to do some investigating. Our Grand Traverse Conservation District website has a ton of very, very well-written information to help you get started. But then I also want you to get out there, and probably not today, but once you can see your soil, you know, digging around, really taking a look at what kind of soil you are looking at as a potential planting site. So is it sandy and droughty? Is it very heavy with more clay and more organic matter? You know, the majority of us really struggle with sandy sites, but some of us do have more clay-lined soils. And so you really need to know your soil and what you're putting that plant into in order to have long-term success. A lot of times we can get a plant, a small seedling, a 2-year-old seedling, to grow for a couple of years. But what we're really looking at and trying to convey to you today is that you're looking at long-term success. You know, we want to see that tree or that shrub in 20 years, in 40 years, in 60 years. You know, we want to make sure that we really did match the right species to the right soil. So we also partner with Michigan State University Extension that offers soil testing. So if you have the capability at some point in your planting, maybe not for this spring, but in the future, to do a soil test, that is also a really, really great tool to get a handle on what you might be able to plant there correctly and what kind of amendments you might be able to do to that soil to have greater planting success. Remember, everything starts with the soil. So really getting to know your dirt is important. Secondly, every plant and every site has to be matched when it comes to the amount of moisture that's going to be available to that little seedling. So again, if you're on a real sandy site, you have to pick a species that long-term is going to be adapted to a sandy soil that the water just drains right through. And we do have wonderful native species that have coexisted on sandy sites for a long time. So you just have to make sure that you're matching the site with the amount of water. And some people tell me, well, I can water it. Well, you might, but depending on the scale of your project, again, we're looking for long long-term success. So we want to make sure that we're still thinking long-term what this tree or shrub is going to need in the way of moisture in order to successfully flower and fruit and go to maturity. Another thing at the bottom is the amount of sunlight. And I talked about that a little bit, like in the woods when we lose a beech and all of a sudden we have a huge pocket and there's a bunch of sunshine hitting that forest floor as an opportunity to be able to plant a species that requires a little bit more sunlight. So you really need to know your site, how much sunlight during the daytime hours is it going to get, really quality sunlight in order for it to perform at its highest and most vigorous level. And lastly, on the right top is the existing vegetative cover. So we know that so many of our sites have a lot of, grasses or perennial weeds that are sucking up a lot of the moisture that we want to be able to control before we put a seedling in there. So we'll talk a little bit about doing some site prep either in advance, a couple of years, or just the day that you're planting. But considering that the new seedling has got to get a free area where there's no existing vegetation in order for any of the available moisture that does hit the spot is sucked up by the new seedling and not by the weeds that you're not necessarily wanting to promote. So matching the site and the species for the right reason is what we're all about here tonight. So again, to consider what native trees and shrubs you want to do, you just are matching your soil type with the light environment, with the water, the ecoregion, and the cold hardiness zone. So we're hopefully supplying you with trees that we are pretty confident are going to do well in our Grand Traverse region. But you also want to think about the aspect of your planting site, if it's on a north facing slope or south facing slope, kind of the microclimates that can really make a difference between a seedling doing well or not. So really look at your site as close down to just that specific site as possible. I do know that so many of the characteristics that landowners come to me and are desiring to add to their landscape revolve around wildlife habitat or species diversity, but you may also have a situation where you're protecting your site from erosion or from the invasion of other non-native plants that want to take over the area. So you just have to match the characteristics that you're looking to build on your property with the right species. And lastly, as a forester, I really like to talk about the future because we do have projections that some diseases or pests are coming our way. So maybe you want to steer clear of that species or building up the number of that species on your property, because we know that it's going to be a challenge to keep it free from insects or disease. So one situation that comes to mind right away, we mentioned oak in the beginning. Red oak is a tree that we continue to offer through the conservation districts because it's a great tree, but we also ask you to put in some white oak. And if you already have red oak, add the white oak, because the white oak family or part of that oak family is not as, it's not as detrimental to if they get the oak wilt fungus. The red oak, it's 100% fatal. White oak, they'll maybe lose a limb or two, a branch or two, but it can survive. So knowing what diseases are out there on the landscape and coming down the pipe is really important when you're making decisions about what species to plant on your property. I like to offer my list, and usually it's just maybe 8 or 10, but I don't know, it keeps growing. And in the beginning I said that tulip poplar was my favorite, and it definitely is my favorite this year. But as you can see, I have a wide variety of trees and shrubs that I get real excited about talking about with people. So these are some trees that maybe aren't available through the Grand Traverse Conservation District, but you might want to look at the Leelanau Conservation District or the Benzie or the Kalkaska or Antrim, and they might have some of these species for you this year. So just some of my favorites that I like to throw out there. So I just want to go quickly through some of the specific purposes or goals that you might have, or I might share with a landowner when I do a site visit. Reasons why you want to plant, matching the site, the species for your goals. So number one is reforestation, or for timber production, and that's somebody with a larger space. Christmas trees, windbreaks, snow fences, erosion control we mentioned, riparian restoration, wildlife food and cover, that understory planting. Kind of new as people are really into forest edibles. So, you know, looking at mini sanctuaries or little intense gardens is really kind of fun. And obviously just adding to the aesthetic quality of your landscape, if it's just your backyard, are really important. And what is really cool about almost all the plantings, if they're done well and planned in advance well, is that they're going to fulfill multiple goals. So that windbreak that's going to protect your farmstead or your homestead from cold winds or shade you in the summer and help you with your cooling bills is also going to provide great habitat for songbirds and small mammals. So, and obviously be pretty. So think about it, whatever you do out there, make it serve multiple goals, and you'll be the winner, and so will our environment. Oopsie, sorry. So reforestation. I would love to meet with someone who has 10 acres or more. That's the kind of the minimum size that makes any sense to do what we call a reforestation project called red pine. And a lot of people tell me they're not really crazy about red pine plantations. You know, it is a monoculture. Yeah, I get that. But again, what this is a good use of fallow land is that it's a really depleted site. Maybe it's been farmed heavily and there's not much in the way of organic matter or potential to grow much else. So our native pine species, red, white, and jack pine, grow on the poorest of soils and produce a product that we all need every day. It grows best in a plantation, and it is efficiently managed right now well. So if you happen to have 10 acres or know someone's got 10 acres, I'd love to include this thought, and it's not for everybody, but it is an exciting way to use fallow land and kind of bring it back. Next, I wanted to talk about Christmas trees. This is a picture on the right of a landowner in Leelanau County that just had about 1/4 of an acre. And on it, he had our native conifers, white pine, white spruce, and balsam fir growing. And, you know, he had maybe 100, maybe 150 Christmas trees planted, all different sizes, as you can tell in the picture, but native trees providing native habitat for our birds and mammals and insects. And then, you know, he was able to harvest some for his friends and family. So it can be done at a really small scale. It can be done at a larger scale, and we can use native species, which is really exciting. These particular native species are well adapted to a lot of our soil conditions, and they don't have any crazy insects or diseases. The non-natives list on the left are great trees, but they require pretty intense business and someone who's going to be in there spraying and getting more involved than maybe you think you want to be. So windbreaks. There isn't a homestead out there, especially, you know, during the winter you see it, but that wouldn't benefit from a really nice planting of trees and shrubs that would prevent winter winds from hitting your house or where your dog is or where you have livestock. It's just using nature to help minimize our energy needs and make life a lot more pleasant. So we like to plant a variety of species that provide really good coverage. A windbreak is something that has to be planned a little bit. So we really like to get together with people and give you some solid on-site technical assistance to make sure that you're planting it in the right spot, you're choosing the right species, the spacing is going to work in maturity, and adding some fun stuff and diversity that's going to make it more beneficial for you as a homeowner and for the wildlife that are also going to use it. So the other kind of living fence is one that's going to protect you and your buildings or the road or your driveway from snow deposition. And this is a super powerful tool that we like to share with landowners that live in the north. And again, it provides the energy savings in heating your home, and maybe in not having to plow your driveway as often. But it does take a lot of planning to make sure that you properly put it in at the right place, because if you don't, you can actually make your snow deposition worse. And I unfortunately have a funny story that I won't share because I'm embarrassed, but it's important to do it right, and we have people that can do it right with you. So think about that if you have a problem with snow deposition on your homestead or your farm. And again, there's not a landowner out there that doesn't talk about wanting to increase habitat for wildlife. And some people I talk to are into game species like deer and grouse and turkey. But I would say more than half are more interested in passive, just being able to observe more wildlife. And what a great way to do it is adding a diverse cover and food for all sorts of animals. And so that it can be done fairly simply or really kind of technical, but what you're looking for is to provide some conifer cover to provide that thermal and escape cover. You're looking at finding trees that are going to grow tall, so they can perching areas for predatory birds. You want to have nesting areas that are appropriate. And then the food for all stages of their life. So that's why we really like to maximize the edge, because we know that so many species need the insects and the herbaceous cover of a field environment where full sunlight hits, but then they also need to get back in and get into the cover of hardwood stands or some conifers in order to enjoy the food safely from predators. So it's something that can be added in any size, in any kind of shape, but what you're trying to do is maximize edge, maximize diversity, and maximize the vertical and horizontal structure. So shrubs, trees, and hardwoods and conifers are going to do that for you. The easiest thing for me to tell you is think about looking at nature. And so often, if you look at nature, you'll see that it tends to put trees in clumps. You know, you'll see a bunch of white pine on the edge of a forest or within the forest. They kind of feed off each other. So what I like to do is just mimic what nature wants to do anyways and expand on that. So planting 5 to 15, 20, whatever you have, white spruce, white pine along a woodlot edge, space them about 8 feet apart. If you have room, you can circle that conifer clump with some hardwoods. You know, some American chestnut, some white oak that we talked about. You want to give them a little more space, so maybe 10 feet apart. And then you could make this whole clump even more incredible by adding those fruit-bearing shrubs on the outside where they'll get plenty of sunlight, so they'll have good fruiting and, you know, good availability to produce the food that the wildlife need. So just a little wildlife clump, if you only have room for one, is just a little haven for wildlife, and really fun to do and beautiful to enjoy. Understory plantings are really important, I think, again, as we're losing some of the species diversity. And there are conifers that do well in the semi-shade. Our native white pine, our state tree, the eastern hemlock, the balsam fir, and the northern white cedar are all conifers that will do well in partial sunshine, shade, and then they'll provide that escape cover within a hardwood story. So along edges or within the forest, these are really good trees to add to your landscape. And I get more calls about people that want food from there, either for themselves or for the wildlife, but sometimes you can share. American hazelnut is one that's really on my list, and black chokecherry. If you can get to those plants before the animals do, it's really a treat. But with intentional forest gardening, you can use pretty intense planting practices to maximize this small space and get some perennial food, fruits and nuts for yourself, and then the leftovers maybe for the animals. But that's been a really fun part of site visits with people that want to be a little more creative and intentional with intensive planting practices. So that's a one. And who doesn't like a service berry or a nice flowering cherry, chokecherry along the landscape come early May. So, you know, we're beautifying our landscape with every single tree that and shrub that we plant out there. So I did want to just finish up my portion and talk about site preparation before you actually get the seedlings. And again, planning is so important. So if you have a large scale project, and I'm talking about a half acre or more, really preparing that site in advance is really going to be the most economical and successful method of site preparation. You know, controlling that existing vegetation without the use maybe of chemicals. So cover crops really can reduce unwanted weeds, non-native and native, and just prepare that site so that you're giving that seedlings, those seedlings really the upper hand, and they don't have to fight what's already out there. A lot of that it used to be done when we did big mechanical tree planting, reforestation. You know, we're not doing that so much more, but it still is something that could be done. If you do need to use an herbicide, again, you're just following the label and applying it in a correct way. But that is some way that a lot of people use and is totally acceptable. It's just not necessarily everybody's method that they want to implement on their property. Most of the people that we deal with are hand planting, and I'm mostly hand planting throughout my life too, but you do have to remove that competing vegetation, and that's really easily done with just a shovel. So you have to scalp away those first couple inches of roots of the perennial vegetation, whether it's grass or some sort of weed, and get rid of it, and then prepare that site with no weeds. At least a foot. If you can do 3 foot, that's even better, around each seedling. And if you can get that work done ahead of time, I like to think about that as splitting up your planting on your back and your energy level. So you can do a lot of site preparation, maybe the week before, and getting it ready. You don't actually dig the hole because you don't want the hole to dry out, but you can get rid of some of the existing vegetation ahead of time and split up your work to get that seedling properly in the ground. So that's where I'm taking it tonight for you guys. And this is my contact information. And I think it'll be up at the end, or another one will be up at the end. So please call me or email me and have me out for a site visit for your forest or for planting questions or just to talk trees. I'm going to turn it over to Reb.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
We can hear you.
Is that Steve?
It is. Hi, Reb.
Good. Hi, Steve. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. For those of you that don't know me, and I'm glad to see some names that are familiar. My name is Reb Ratliff. I'm a parkland steward for the Grand Traverse Conservation District. Have been for about 8 years now. And my experience has come through mostly planting bare root seedlings on many of the 9 parklands that we manage throughout Grand Traverse County, 2 of which are the Brown Birch Quiet Area and the Natural Education Reserve that were the former homes of a couple hydro dams along the Boardman River, and a lot of efforts gone into restoring those bottomlands post dam removal with beautiful native trees and shrubs along the riverbanks. So that's really where my experience comes from, and a lot of what I'll speak on will be geared towards hand planting smaller quantities, kind of like Kama mentioned. Not too often are people doing real, interested in these workshops that are doing real large scale projects. So more or less can be geared towards smaller efforts with a shovel. Brief overview of what I'll go through here. A couple of things to consider before you place your order, handling your seedlings once you have them, a few planting techniques, and then a little bit of follow-up maintenance. So Kim provided a great list of desirable plant attributes or goals. She referenced them as you know, the why you are planting. So I won't necessarily go through that. And then she touched on the soil conditions, and like Kim said, it all starts with the soil. So matching the proper species, the proper soil will be a key part of your success. The soil testing mentioned through MSU Extension, I believe that runs somewhere between $10 and $15, at least I did a few years ago. And I haven't used it since, I want to say 2015, but the soil amendment recommendations that came back were really helpful for a couple of restoration projects that we did, including like a grassland restoration too. So even just beyond tree and shrub work, if you want your garden soils tested or for a prairie restoration, all that, the soil test can be incredibly useful. Kim also touched on the sunlight conditions, so I'll pass by that. So most nurseries will only sell bare root seedlings during the off season. So unlike the large potted and balled and burlap trees, you're really limited to planting bare root seedlings in the spring and fall. There's been a lot of debate over the years at the district if there is one season that's even better than the other in terms of spring and fall. And I've heard arguments both ways, but generally from what we've seen, we're starting to feel like there is a little bit of an advantage planting in the spring. We never typically like to let a planting season pass, so we certainly plant in both seasons, but the consensus is kind of leaning towards a spring planting will allow a little bit of root growth and establishment in that new location to be able to survive that first winter. But again, if you're able to, you really can't go wrong with planting in both seasons, and that kind of speaks to the account for mortality bullet there. The bare root seedlings are resilient. All of our plants are, but they are also sensitive, and they can be frustrating and very difficult to establish. And the relative affordability of bare root seedlings compared to like a $30 or $50 potted plant or a $200 to $500 larger tree is you've got power in numbers. And generally speaking, we hope for a survival rate by year 3 somewhere around 50 to 75% is actually pretty good. So don't become too discouraged if you're not around the 100% mark, because it is very difficult, and you can really just plan to plant more than you hope to have established in the long run. You've gotten your seedlings from the Conservation District. Typically, the Grand Traverse Conservation District will bundle your seedlings in groups of that species with typically a shredded paper around the roots, and we'll have watered the roots prior to pickup, so they will be sent home at a nice moist level. And it's important to maintain that moisture from the time you pick them up until they get into the ground. If you're not sourcing the seedlings from us, you may want to open them up to see if there's anything in there and consider adding sawdust, peat moss, shredded paper, or something in there. If you're going to be holding on to the seedlings for a short period before you plan to put them into the ground. Be sure to store them in a dark, cool location, typically like under a front porch or on the back side of a house. You do just want to make sure that you're not leaving them somewhere where they might get browsed on. You don't want to leave them in the trunk of your car, even for an afternoon, or in the window of your car, so they don't greenhouse and get really hot. And I have seen mold grow on roots that have stayed in their packaging for more than a week or so. So you want to keep an eye on those if they're not going in the ground right away. When you do get to unpacking your seedlings, I see a lot of volunteers that come out to our work bees, will grab a bundle and they'll just kind of pull them apart. And a lot of times when these seedlings are packaged together, the roots do get intertwined in that. And just to ensure the greatest survivability of that plant, you want to keep as many of those roots healthy and intact. So it seems kind of like a no-brainer, but again, just pull them apart. Typically when the conservation districts gets them from a nursery, they really are bundled and bound together. When we divide them apart and to bundle them up for seedling sales, we have kind of separated them ourselves, but they still will be rebundled to some degree, and just be careful when unpacking them. You may soak the roots in water for several hours leading up to planting. You do not want to soak them overnight, or I have heard people say that it's okay to do more than just a few hours, but I would not encourage you to leave them in standing water for more than a day. It wouldn't be doing the plant much good beyond that. And these bare roots are, they dry out incredibly quickly, both by wind and sun. So just be careful. So even if, even on a windy or a sunny day, if you break open your bundle and they're exposed to the sun or wind for just a matter of minutes, that moisture is gonna whip right off, and and then you're already getting behind that goal of trying to maintain that moisture from pickup to installation. And I have heard that direct exposure of UV light is known to negatively impact root function and growth as well. So whatever it takes, just try to keep them out of the sun and wind. If you can't get to planting your seedlings right away, you can heal them in. Katie, if you'd like to switch slides, please. Healing in plants is a way to just keep them on standby until you're ready. It's basically just planting them temporarily. Rather than a hole, you're planting, or you're kind of creating a two-dimensional trench where you'll just enclose close up that trench against the plants, and you don't need to pack them too tight. If they're going to be healed in for long periods of time, you're going to run the risk of the plants wanting to start to grow into that soil or grow into each other. So I have heard of people healing in plants in the fall over winter because they didn't have time to get to planting all of their seedlings. That is something you're able to do. It's probably the most appropriate time to heal in plants, but you definitely don't want to plan on having plants healed in for long periods of time during the growing season, because they will begin to grow into each other and into that ground. So, and be careful where you heal them into, because I've healed in plants before and shown up and the deer had come and had a buffet of them all in a row. Next slide, please. So when you're ready to plant, especially those of you that live in urban areas, call Misdig. It's a free service. I think it's paid into by the utility companies, underground wires, and all the utilities. It only takes a day or two for them to get out to do it, and watch for your overhead wires. And because the last thing you want to do is accidentally splice a wire, and then you're gonna have to answer to somebody. So it's a free service. They're really quick, and if there's any question in doubt or any question at all, just don't hesitate. Avoid digging holes too far in advance. Kim mentioned this. We've had a lot of contractors that we've had to doing large scale projects that will go ahead using like an auger and piloting a bunch of holes, and those holes being left open are drying out very quickly. So if any of you are going to send your teenage kid out into the yard to pre-dig all the holes, just be a little leery of doing so. Even if you intend to put in a fully wet and ready root system and plan to water the seedling afterwards, just do be careful about digging those holes too soon, because those, just like looking at the soil attached to the bare roots, you're going to be able to tell when they're getting dried out and gray. When you dig a hole for a seedling, if you watch the inside of that hole, it will change colors, and you can visibly notice the soil pits drying out in a matter of just a few minutes. You do want to, of course, remove the vegetation around your seedling. I think Cam has said 1 to 3 feet. I agree with that. Kind of the more the better, especially the sod grass wicks up a lot of that rain that the plant's going to want. So if you're using a planting bar, which is maybe something I get to here in a little bit, and you're not digging a hole, that's going to be one disadvantage of using that tool, is you're not getting rid of that surrounding vegetation. The depth of your hole is also really important. Every species has a different length root system to it, and even the different same species will have different roots. And when you're out there digging your holes, always take a look at the next seedling in line, and look at the length of that root system to determine how deep you have to dig your hole, so you don't have to you don't spend too much extra energy digging a hole too deep and then have to put some in, or there's a bunch of problems that can happen if your hole's too shallow. Yeah, and if you are doing a large amount of plantings, you can consider getting a gas-powered auger available at many local rental companies. And then the planting bar, known as a double bar, is another tool commonly used by reforesting companies that do large-scale plantings, post-harvest or after a wildfire or something. And the disadvantage to that is you're not typically going to remove any surrounding vegetation, and you're also planting the root systems more on a two-dimensional plane. So how a double bar works is it's just a flat kind of short shovel that you stick into the ground, and you make kind of a V-shaped hole in the ground. You put your root in, and then you reinsert the dibble next to that, and then you push that gap closed. And it's a quick and effective way of doing it, but unless you're doing a large scale project, I would recommend using a shovel and making an actual circular hole. Most seedlings that you will receive are pretty evident to be able to tell the depth at which it grew at the nursery, you can tell right above the root collar, there's usually a soil stain that will tell you the depth at which it grew. And you want to try to match that as best as you can. Conifers are especially vulnerable to stem rot if they're planted too deep. And why don't you move to the next slide, Katie, please? Let's see. So we do have incredibly sandy soils in our region, and depending on the history of your site, sometimes it can be hard to know how kind of naturally intact your soils are, especially those closer to more urban areas. But even in rural areas, knowing how that land may have been manipulated in the past through forestry operations, or when areas were prepped for developments. You really don't know until you dig a hole and check what sort of organic content or kind of natural soils you may have. So we're often asked how much compost should be used with your seedlings, and we generally steer people away from adding too many organic amendments into your soils, although it can be beneficial, but just do so with caution. And like, for example, because so many times we're planting in areas where we have a lot of sod grass, you scurf away that couple inches of sod, which is holding all the organic, 2 or 3 inches of organic soil. It can be nice to try to get as much of that organics out of that rooty mat as possible, to kind of jumble back into your mix of sandier soils, just so you're not eliminating, all that hard-earned organic top layer that's built up over time. You just want to make sure that you don't leave too many grass roots behind, because those roots are resilient, and we don't want them to reestablish themselves around the seedling. Adding too much compost will increase chances of nutrient shock to the plant. So we want that seedling to be surrounded predominantly by the soils in which it's going to grow out to and into and establish itself within. But if you feel that a little bit of organics can help improve the situation, just do so cautiously. Another thing you can do to ensure that the plants maintain moisture is use a product called TerraSorb that we sell through our seedling sale. It's a synthetic polymer of some sort, very similar to what they use in baby diapers, actually. I forget the statistic on it, but it can hold something like 300 times its weight in water. And this is a really great product where it's not very expensive. It a little bit goes a long way. You just add water to it in a bucket, you make a slurry, and then you dip your seedlings into it before putting them into the ground. So I would recommend soaking your seedlings for a few hours, then dipping them into the TerraSorb, and then putting them directly into the ground. And again, if you don't if you're not using TerraSorb, you can use a little bit of shredded paper and peat moss around the plant roots at the time of installation as well, to put them into the ground. The idea, especially with the TerraSorb, is during times of drought, those little particles will retain that moisture against the roots for a longer period of time. And then the use of mulch is also incredibly important. You just need 2 or 3 inches of mulch, typically just wood chips around your seedlings. Besides just reducing potential growth of competing vegetation, it really reduces the rate of rain water evaporating off the soil right away. So when the rain comes down, if it falls through a couple layers of wood chips and hits the soil, and that top layer of soil's becoming saturated, having that layer of mulch on top is going to allow that moisture to stay there much longer than if the ground were exposed to the sun and wind. And so it's not always possible to, mulch hundreds or thousands of seedlings, but if you're just planting a few dozen, and you can often find wood chips pretty affordably. Those of you that live in city limits can possibly get free wood chips from the city yard. I forget the name of it, but highly encouraged, if possible. The few inches of mulch will do the seedling wonders. Next slide, please. So these are the common planting problems. It's a good illustration. You'd think that it's pretty obvious, but until you see things visually, sometimes it just helps to make sense of what could go wrong. The most common problems I see when we do our public planting work bees are either J-rooting or U-rooting, and too shallow or too deep. So you'll know you're planting the plants too shallow if any of the top roots are above ground, too shallow, and you're going to lose some of the moisture out of those top roots, and it'll stress the plant too. Planting too deep is a little bit harder to kind of check visually, as you're planting or after you've planted, or to check on somebody else's tree that's planted it. So again, you kind of just want to eyeball that root crown and aim for that, that depth at which it grew at the nursery. Match that as best you can. Conifer species are known to be more susceptible to stem rot if they're planted too deep, so just be aware of that. And then air pockets is another thing. I just wanted to mention that after you've got the plant in the ground, you can just put your hand weight and give it a nice little pack. You don't need to use your heel to pack around the seedling with all of your body weight. That's going to maybe over compact the soils and then not let the water drain down into the roots as easily. So just a nice firm compaction is what you're looking for, and that will ensure that you don't leave any air pockets down there. Yeah, go ahead, Katie. Thank you. For follow-up, watering your seedlings, water is kind of the theme for getting these seedlings to establish. One rule of thumb I've heard is a gallon of water per seedling per week. Not always do you have the luxury of reaching your irrigation hose to all of your seedlings. If you can, that's great. Just be sure not to overwater. And then again, try to understand what amount of water your species wants, ideally. So a lot of them have ranges of different, soil moisture preferences, and some are a little bit pickier than others. So just, but as a general rule of thumb, a gallon of water a week is what I've been telling people. And then browse protectors. Boy, there's something about, especially deer, they know what tree was growing naturally and what tree was recently planted by humans, because they tend to want to go after them right after we do big projects. They're interested. I don't know if it's something to do with the soils being churned up, but deer and rabbits are definitely something that you may have to protect your seedlings from. And at our seedling sale, we do offer tubes that come with a stake, and they're translucent, so they do allow sunlight to go in. They typically stand above the plant so the tops don't get browsed, and they really are just buying the seedling enough time to establish itself so that, you know, a few years down the line, even if it's not taller than or coming out of the tube, if that tube gets replaced and it does get browsed a little bit, it's got enough root establishment where it can bounce back and be able to survive. We also sell garlic sticks at our seedling sale. Similar to the garlic-based sprays, it's just the nasty smell. It's been known to keep deer and rabbits away. I haven't had a lot of experience with this. One issue with at least the sprays is that you might need to time it with weather forecast, because it will, you know, lessen in smell or wash off with every rain. So it could become potentially expensive if you have to reapply it a lot. But just another thing. And then fertilize. The district does sell fertilizers at our seedling sale, but we just caution people to make sure that you follow the rates and use seedling formulated fertilizers. Don't exceed the rates, very important. And there are, you know, a lot of natural fertilizers to consider out there as well. You know, just don't become discouraged and continue to learn. It can be challenging, and but it's always rewarding. So, and I guess with that, I'd like to make one last plug for some work bee events we have coming this spring on April 30th and May 1st, right here where the Boardman River Nature Center is located. We're going to be planting native trees and shrubs along the banks of the Boardman River, right where the Sabin Powerhouse used to be, out in the lovely, recently exposed bottomlands. So if you're interested in learning more about the dams removal project, or if you want to get some practice in on planting some seedlings that we provide for that event before heading out to your property to do your own, please feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thanks, Reb. Now, if everyone would give me just a second, I am going to play a recording from Maddie Baroli, who heads up the ATRAP program that we participate in. And it was recorded from a previous event, so there may be some things that don't make perfect sense, but Maddie will be joining us for the question and answer session later. So have her take it away.
All right. Hi again, everyone. So to kind of frame the second half of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the Assisted Tree Range Expansion Project. So this project is going on its second season. We had a really successful first season last year, despite COVID. But basically, it's a community-based planting and monitoring initiative in Northwest Lower Michigan. So first, let's just define assisted range expansion. So it can be defined as the intentional movement of species to areas just outside of their established range in response to climate change, facilitating or mimicking natural range expansion. So you might think to yourself, well, don't trees have the capacity to migrate into areas with maybe more favorable conditions on their own? And that is true. However, with the pace of anthropogenic climate change, coupled with an increasingly fragmented landscape, it makes it very difficult for those adaptation processes and that natural range expansion to occur in our modern context. So that's why starting to establish more local populations of some of these species that are projected to do well under future climate conditions, especially on agricultural land within our landscape, is something really supportive that we can do. Additionally, planting these trees now will help us to increase ecosystem diversity and also kind of offset some of those widespread tree die-offs that we're having, which will ultimately help to improve the resilience of our forests and landscape as a whole. Now, the basic premise of this project is to engage people in planting species projected to have suitable new habitat in this region, and then monitor their trees and report some simple annual growth and health measurements. But before we get into the details on how to participate in the project and on the species that we're recommending to you all, I want to talk a little bit about our changing climate and the implications for our region's forested ecosystems. All right, so here's kind of a lineup of the various forest stressors and disturbances that impact our region and are kind of increasingly impacting our region. So on the upper left, you have a really large old beech tree that has rotted out and snapped due to being infected with beech bark disease. Right next to that, you can see from the air this concentration of dead oak trees due to the fungal pathogen oak wilt. On the bottom left, you have the sort of face of herbivory in Northwest Michigan, and that's it's really adorable, but it can really cause some issues in terms of stifling regeneration of the forest understory. And then next to that, you have a really nasty Japanese barberry invasion. So that's just totally taken over the forest understory, and again is stifling that regeneration of the trees that will eventually make up, the next generation of the overstory of the forest. And then, of course, on the right, we have the infamous storm of August 2015, kind of showing those increasingly intense precipitation and extreme weather events, which lead to, as you can see in the bottom, oftentimes devastation of local ecosystems. In this case, this is Alligator Hill area. So the ecological implications of all this, as some of these things kind of stack on top of each other, is that we have a loss of species diversity, which implies that our forests become less resilient to future disturbances. The concentration of tree mortality often allows invasive species to get a stronger foothold and kind of just leads to that feedback loop of unsuccessful regeneration. And then you have impacts for our wildlife populations that rely on some of the species that we're losing. So for instance, the bear and other forest mammals who rely on the rich, nutrient-dense beech nuts as a part of their diet. And then you also have, your cultural and socioeconomic considerations. So, forests are a huge part of our culture and our lifestyle in this area. And there's also the cost to private landowners associated with tree treatment or removal, which can be really burdensome financially. So, this is kind of just to give you a sense. I'm sure most people have kind of been seeing a lot of these things happening. But the issue is that then we have climate change kind of coming in as like a threat multiplier. So kind of exacerbating these regional disturbances. So these are some regional climate change projections. Over the past century, much of this region has already warmed between 1 and 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you have these projections, which are from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And first I'll talk about these figures. So the columns within each of these figures represent 2 climate change scenarios, a low emissions and a high emissions scenario. So the lower emissions is on the left, and the higher emissions is on the right within each figure, respectively. So yeah, temperatures are expected to increase between 2 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of the next century, specifically in the winter months and the summer months. And then there's a discrepancy between the 2 models in terms of whether precipitation is going to generally increase or decrease, but what the models do agree on is that our rainfall is going to be delivered primarily in more heavy precipitation events, which is defined as greater than 8 centimeters in one event. And we're also seeing indicators that ecosystems are changing in tandem with the climate already. So leaf out and flowering dates have moved about a week earlier, and growing seasons are projected to lengthen substantially. So that's a nice perk in some ways. And then also dry soils late in the growing season, however, are leading to drought stress. Which can be, obviously problematic in an agricultural context, but also in terms of the regeneration of the young forest. And then last but not least, winters are becoming less severe, which allows for greater forest pest survival. So those pest populations are able to kind of grow and get more out of control and have a greater impact on our forests. Now I'll get into what some of those species that we're recommending as part of the Assisted Tree Range Expansion Project are. So we kicked off the project with 6 tree species, which you can see here. We have tulip tree, shagbark hickory, swamp white oak, hackberry, black gum, and sassafras. And they're all incredibly beautiful in their own right and have really been a joy to learn about and get to know and work with throughout this process. And so I'm sure you're now wondering on how we settled on these species. These were the main criteria for choosing our species. So in addition to determining, which species have that projected new habitat or projected increase in habitat under future climate conditions, we also consulted with other local foresters and extension resources to make sure we were selecting species that were appropriate for the region and, sensitive to some of these other disturbances we experience. So for instance, we wanted to choose species that are not preferred for deer browse. We wanted them to not be preferred hosts for the Asian longhorned beetle, which is a pest that we're not currently dealing with in this region, but we might end up dealing with infestations of in the future. And then, of course, we wanted to select species that provide certain wildlife benefits, and as well as provide a mix of options for folks based on, their unique site and site characteristics. So yeah, just making sure that we had options for people. So I want to take a second to highlight this first point, since that's kind of the foundation for what we're talking about. The Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science is a group that collaborates with the Forest Service, universities, conservation organizations, and forest industry to provide information on managing forests for climate change adaptation. And they've produced something called a climate vulnerability assessment for northern Lower Michigan, and it includes projections on which tree species are expected to decline, increase, or expand into new territory. So there are over 35 species whose ranges reach their northern limits in mid-Michigan, but we wanted to kind of boil it down and choose the ones predicted to have the most success in the region, and follow these kind of guidelines we created for ourselves. So I'm going to share sort of a summary table from that climate vulnerability assessment that sort of helped to inform our project. And so this is just the introduction page. If you want to, dig more into this information, you can visit www.forestadaptation.org. But yeah, essentially, these are the results from 2 different climate projection models used for the region. Here's that summary table, and you can see the 6 ATRAP species sort of outlined in yellow. And you'll note that the majority of the species we selected either have a blue star within their row, which denotes new habitat for a species that's not currently present in the region, or they have a green triangle, which indicates an increase in suitable habitat by greater than 20% by the year 2100. And so there's also sort of an adaptability or confidence rating score on the right-hand side of each of those rows. And that kind of indicates whether or not the species is expected to do even better than modeled under these models, or whether certain stressors might make it more difficult for the species to adapt. So again, if you want to learn more about this, please visit forestadaptation.org and you can do some further reading. But without further ado, I'm going to launch into talking about some of the qualities of each of these trees. First, we have the tulip tree, which was also referred to as the yellow poplar in the previous slide. And this is one of the largest trees in North America. If you've ever spent any time traveling in Appalachia, you're definitely familiar with the tulip tree. This tree likes well-drained soils, but does need consistent watering. It's definitely a sun lover, so it's shade intolerant, and for that reason, we recommend it as an ornamental yard tree if you're just planting, you know, one or two. And it also would make a great forest edge planting or an open field planting if you're looking to do some afforestation. It's also the larval host to many pollinators, such as the swallowtail butterfly and Promethea moth, and it's loved by the Baltimore oriole, the scarlet tanager, and hummingbirds and bees. It has a fast growth rate, which can lead to a sort of weak wood structure, so we do recommend planting it somewhere where it's not likely to, you know, be exposed to as much wind or ice damage. And it commonly associates with tupelo, white pine, oak, and beech. Next, we have one of my favorite trees from mid and southern Michigan, the shagbark hickory. It's a large deciduous tree known for its distinctive peeling bark, its long lifespan, and its delicious edible nuts. It is only somewhat shade tolerant, so it will often be found growing slowly in the forest understory, and then when there's that gap of sunlight, it will rapidly respond to that. Its nuts and bark support a variety of wildlife, such as fox, squirrel, rabbit, and bear. And then also you have bats, which love to take shelter under that loose, shaggy bark. And this tree commonly associates with oak, maple, basswood, redbud, and tupelo. The swamp white oak is one of our good choices for wet or lowland sites with occasional flooding. But you know, the name is sort of misleading because this tree also tolerates drier soils and can do fairly well in drought. So it's nice in that it's quite versatile. Because it belongs to the white oak group as opposed to the red oak, it is actually not nearly as susceptible to the oak wilt fungal pathogen, so that makes it a great choice for offsetting some of those losses we're seeing due to oak wilt. This is, you know, a mast crop tree, so its acorns are a really important food source for all of the usual suspects: squirrels, mice, beaver, black bear, ducks, and turkey. And yeah, it commonly associates with other white oak, ash, cottonwood, and tamarack. Hackberry is a super hardy tree. It is, you know, medium-sized in stature and has this really interesting corky bark that really sets it apart. Even in the winter, you can tell right away it's a hackberry. This tree is tolerant of extreme cold, both dry and wet sites, as well as compaction and road salts. So for that reason, it's commonly planted as an urban tree. But yeah, it's really just super versatile, and it is one of our species that is more shade tolerant. So yeah, it's capable of growing in shade with good soils, but also does great in full sun. It does provide difficult to come by sustenance sort of in the early winter season for turkey, pheasant, quail, grouse, and songbirds like the cedar waxwing. And it is the larval host to the morning cloak and question mark butterflies. The black gum is our other really good option for wet sites. It prefers acidic soils and it's often found growing directly on stream and ravine banks. It has a really beautiful, striking scarlet fall foliage, which is lovely. And its fruits are a really important source of food for migrating birds in the autumn. And bees also love the nectar of these tiny flowers. So if you've ever heard of Tupelo honey, that comes from bees pollinating another species within the same genus. So yeah, bees really enjoy these trees. And the black gum commonly associates with ironwood, black cherry, dogwood, oak, and hickory. And last but not least, we have the sassafras tree. And actually this, it sort of has more of a shrub-like habit when it's in the forest understory, but it does grow into a mid-sized tree in full sun. This tree is tolerant of both drought and shade. So that's quite nice. And if you've ever scratched a sassafras twig, you'll be reminded that it was traditionally used to create root beer flavor. So I always enjoy finding sassafras and scratching on the twig a little bit and smelling that. This tree is larval host to many pollinators, including the spicebush butterfly, swallowtail butterflies, and the Palamedes butterfly. One thing is that this tree can grow by suckers and will oftentimes form thickets. So you might want to, plant it somewhere where you're not going to mind it potentially doing that if it does well. And sassafras commonly associates with dogwood, beech, maple, oak, ash, and tulip tree. So that's the good word on each of the ATREP species. And I definitely want to encourage you to reach out to either Kama or myself if you have any questions about them, and we'll have a chance to dig into those at the Q&A session. But now I want to talk a little bit about engaging with the community science aspect of this project if you do decide that you're interested in planting some of these species. I like to remind folks that, in Michigan, we have about 50% private forest land. And in Leelanau County, for instance, private forest land, it makes up about 73% of the forested landscape. So, informing and engaging people is really key to understanding and managing our regional forests well. So that's, a little bit behind why I'm interested in keeping track of these plantings. And, compared to a typical academic study, we definitely lose some of the rigor in terms of how controlled things are. But this approach is really nice because it broadens our study area. So instead of working with, one partner or just planting in one location, we can gain insights from diverse sites throughout Grand Traverse, Leelanau, and Benzie counties. Plus, we have a really simple data collection and input protocol, so it just makes it really simple and fun to participate in the process. So here are the steps for participating. You can kind of let Kama or myself know that you would like to participate. And then you can go ahead and order your trees through your local conservation district or through some of the wonderful local nurseries that Kama is going to talk about later. And then once you receive your trees and plant them, you can register the species and register the tree with the project. So each tree will get a unique ID code that's based on its species, and then you record the number of trees that you planted. And then really we just ask for a simple annual report of certain measurements related to tree growth and health, and namely whether or not it's still alive. And so you can submit the data yourself on our website through this form, or with the help of the district forester if you just need to get in touch with Kama. And these are just some screenshots from the website. You can go and check it out for yourself at atrep.net. But you can just basically get an overview of the project and read a little bit more about those species that I just went over and kind of re-reference that material. And yeah, you can submit your data and also interact with this map where we're going to be populating it with all of the trees that are being planted through this project and the data that is being submitted for them. So that's still in the works. It's something I'm still working on putting together based on last season's submissions to the project. But yeah, just come to this website to kind of watch the project progress. And if you're really stoked on this project and you want to share about it with your friends, this is a great resource. It's a video produced by Joe Vandermolen of Nature Change, and it just gives a brief overview of the project and invites people to participate. So you can find it on the Nature Change website, naturechange.org, or directly on YouTube with that link. And finally, here are some great photos of the fun we had planting our Atrep species last spring. These were all right in the nick of time, basically just at the beginning of COVID. Most folks here are part of the same household anyway, but that's the great thing about tree planting. It's something you can do safely outdoors. And so even if we are still struggling with COVID this spring, we encourage you to safely get some family and friends together to join in some tree planting fun. So with that, I want to thank you for listening, and Kama and I both really look forward to our conversation during the roundtable later this month. Thank you.
All right, big thanks to Maddie for that. And I will continue on before we get to our question and answer session. If you hear screaming in the background, that's my bird, so don't worry about him. So a little bit about Grand Traverse Conservation District seedling sale. As Kama mentioned, we're selling all native species. In the past, conservation districts have been maybe part of the problem selling things like autumn olive. And so by committing to only selling native species, we're not going to have any invasive species. As everybody already said, that also means that they're hardy and have lots of habitat connections. We sell exclusively bare root seedlings and in groups of 5 or 1,000 and a couple of groups in between there. So it's a great way to get a great rate for a lot of trees and shrubs. Our goal at GTCD was to offer diversity. So we started with 32 species and we have been having our sale for about a month now. So we only have 11 species left, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on. But I do want to point out that, of course, I would love it if you all shopped exclusively at GTCD. However, there are some other fantastic folks out there, as Kama mentioned, other conservation districts. When I've done some planting on some family properties, I actually ended up buying seedlings from 5 different conservation districts because I wanted exactly the right height or the right price or the right species. So it is a-okay to shop around. No one's going to be mad. And then, of course, there are also nurseries and landscapers and garden centers that sell fantastic trees year-round, and maybe in some of those bigger sizes that you might be interested in. And I'll talk more about those at the end. As Reb mentioned, we do sell some Seedling Care products. He talked about Terrasorb, which is the goo that helps keep the water on the roots of your plants. We also sell pin flags to help you find your little baby trees out in the middle of a field or forest, and you can write on those flags to help you know what you planted. We do sell garlic sticks, which are these little sticks containing some garlic and chili pepper oil that usually last, I believe it's 12 to 18 months. And those are great, especially for shrubs that you might not want to put into a tree tube. And they really do work pretty well. Some of those sprays work great as well, but are a little bit shorter lived, as Reb said. I do want to take a moment to talk about our tree tubes because we got some really nice ones this year. They are 5 feet tall, so they're really going to protect your seedlings from browse of everything from mice to deer, and for a very long time. They are sturdy, they're meant to last and be reused. So if you plant a tree and it grows up and grows tall out of it, you can tear down the side. It's perforated, so you can tear down the side and then use zip ties to put it around a seedling, 5 years down the road. It comes with a rod to help it stay in the ground and stay safe. And the thing that I'm honestly most excited about with these tree tubes is this little bag at the top, because that is a mesh bag that will help keep our birds safe. There have been cases where songbirds are perched on the edge and they slip a little and they fall in and are unable to get out. And so that little mesh lets your tree grow up and out unimpeded, but keeps birds safe. Because if we're growing these plants for wildlife, we want to make sure that we're keeping our wildlife safe. So they are a little bit of the Cadillac of tree tubes, but I think that they're worth it. Kama mentioned a lot about picking the right species for your site. And I'm not going to get terribly into this right now, but I do want to point out that we offer a variety of species for every kind of site that you have, and for every sort of goal that you have. And so just thinking about, I have a wetter site. All right, let's go into a shrub that can handle some straight up flooding like buttonbush, or really be great at holding down a shoreline of a lake or stream like pussy willow. Is it really super dry? American hazelnut and New Jersey tea can super handle that. They're going to do a great job. And here is our New Jersey tea. This one's buttonbush, and this is pussy willow, of course. Hopefully you recognize those sweet little flowers. We also have some shrubs that are a little bit shade tolerant. Of course, you're going to sacrifice some blooms, but they are still going to grow great and provide fantastic habitat. If you're after fruiting, of course, there are tons of shrubs that have beautiful fruits that are delectable for people as well as critters. And then a lot of folks talk about, that snow fence sounds great, but I don't really need a snow fence. I live in a neighborhood, but I am after a privacy fence that I don't have to paint every year. And so several of those species that do some clonal spreading could be great for that. And so hazelnut can take it dry, pussy willow can take it wet, and red osier dogwood can handle just about everything in between. Similar situation with trees. We have trees for wet, for dry, for shade tolerant. I'm not going to read through all of these because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A, and because I know this is getting recorded so you can check back later. But as Maddie pointed out, we even have trees for areas that are salt and air pollution heavy. Get that hackberry, put it in there, it'll survive, especially if you're able to baby it along a little bit with some water. I wanted to highlight some of the species that we do have left. So those 11 species that we have left includes the very drought tolerant American hazelnut. This is fantastic, as Kama said, for a wildlife habitat. This is the you're not gonna be able to keep critters off of it. If you get a hazelnut, I want to hear about it, because the critters will be there first. One thing to note is that if you do want to protect it to begin with, because the deer do love to eat it. Once it is established, it is a very strong, hardy grower, and it does spread clonally, so it'll be able to hold its own. But when it's a little tiny baby, those deer could just chomp it right down. It can take the sandy soils, it can take full sun. Right out in the middle of a field and in the sand is a-okay with it. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the buttonbush, which is one of our more shade tolerant species. You often see this in a wet area in the middle of the forest where it's too wet for anything else to grow. Buttonbush attracts hummingbirds and feeds everything from birds to mammals with its seeds, and just does a really fantastic job. It's also a clonal spreader, but much, much slower. More sun, like I said, it'll handle shade, but more sun will give you more of those really cool globe blooms that it's named for. Very, very cool shrub. Talked a little bit about pussy willow. Of course, we all love seeing its cute, fuzzy little flowers in the spring, and those are important for pollinators as well. This shrub is also pretty deer tolerant, and it's great right down to the water's edge and great for erosion control. Maddie did a great job talking about the black gum. So I won't get too much more there, but I will say that although we don't have a lot of clay soil in our area, the black gum can tolerate clay soil. So if that's what you're looking for, this one's great. Hackberry, again, Maddie did a fantastic job chatting about it. It has really cool bark. I just can't say enough how cool that bark is, and it makes a fantastic street tree that supports lots of wildlife. Sassafras, again, Maddie did a fantastic job, another Atrex species. So it will grow clonally. I've heard it more growing clonally in sun because it doesn't need to get tall. And then I took this picture this fall. This beautiful tree in the middle with that bright orange top is a sassafras. So because it needed to grow up and out, it got really tall there. But in either case, it's a fantastic tree. This one's very deer resistant. That smell that we really enjoy, the deer do not want to eat. So if you have an area that you need a tree or a clonal situation that the deer are not going to eat, this is a tree for you. But it also does support lots and lots of wildlife, like Maddie said. Quaking aspen is another fantastic tree for wildlife of all sorts, especially game species. It's very fast growing. It can really handle our sandy soils, but it can also handle clay. It does spread clonally, so you do want to plan for that. Usually it's not horrendously aggressive, but some days it really likes the place it's at and wants to grow. So do take that into account. White oaks, as Kama said, are a fantastic tree for all sorts of situations. This is one of the best trees for wildlife. The oak genus supports over 500 species of butterflies and moths, and those caterpillars for those butterflies and moths are what feeds our songbirds. And so these are fantastic trees. And as Kama said, this tree is less susceptible to oak wilt. So if we can avoid oak wilt and still provide fantastic habitat, beautiful shade, that's exactly what we want to do. And of course, it's also got great timber value. Oak is a wonderfully strong wood. You have to wait a little while, but it is fantastic. Moving on to our conifers, we have balsam fir, which, as Kama mentioned, makes a glorious Christmas tree, and it also works great for wreaths. It is a little bit slower growing for an evergreen, so maybe you just want to use it for festive clippings, but it smells incredible. If pine cones bother you, fir cones will be your best friends because they shatter. You won't ever find a fir cone on the ground. They fall apart and you won't have to hit them with your lawnmower and send them to break a window, which has never happened to me, I promise. Red pine, Cam already extolled its virtues in dry, sandy soil, and it really does a great job of growing in places that most others won't. I would really recommend, if you're not planting it specifically for lumber, mixing in some other species to get a good diversity there and really support habitat. Northern white cedar is a really cool tree, particularly because it can grow everywhere from the water's edge, although it doesn't like to get its feet wet. If you notice on the banks of the lake, it's always got its roots kind of curved up and back. So it doesn't like to be too wet, but as long as it's not getting flooded, it can handle it. And then it can take it right into very, very dry situations. Its needles aren't pokey, so if that's something you're worried about, that's great. And it can tolerate clay and basic soils, all sorts of sun, air pollution. It's just a really hardy, gorgeous tree. Again, this is one that deer really like. So it can be super useful to use a tree tube to help it get up and out of the reach a little bit before exposing it to those hungry mouths. I wanted to point you in the direction of some great resources. Of course, your local conservation district, including the Grand Traverse Conservation District, is a great place. If you have questions, come to us. We're here to answer your questions or help find the answer or send you to the person who can get you the answer. I also wanted to put in a plug for your local cooperative invasive species management areas, which here in Grand Traverse County and in Benzie, Leelanau, and Manistee as well is the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network, which is also based out of the Grand Traverse Conservation District. So if you have questions about invasive species, we can help you with that. I also wanted to point out a couple of places that are great to learn more about trees. Of course, the GTCD website has a lot about the plants that we're selling, but there are a lot more trees out there. And so the Missouri Botanical Garden Plant Finder and the Morton Arboretum are both fantastic, particularly for native plants. I also wanted to take a moment to talk to you about Go Beyond Beauty, which is a program to recognize particularly businesses, but also individuals and groups committing to not sell or use high priority invasive species, because many of those species are still sold completely legally. So these are folks who are going above and beyond the law. And many of these businesses also sell native species. So if you're looking for these trees and seedlings outside of the very short conservation district sales, these are the folks to head to. So those logos with yellow butterflies, bioconcentric, bird's foot, black cap, Simon Gardens, Garden Goods, Greystone Gardens, and Misty Ridge all sell at least 20 species of native plants. And the two in the middle there, Bird's Foot and Black Cat Farms, sell exclusively native trees, or well, native plants. Some of them sell trees and some of them don't. But these are some really fantastic businesses to support. And then of course, landscapers as well, still folks going above and beyond what is required by law to help protect our natural areas. If you are interested in participating in Go Beyond Beauty, we also love to work with the public, but of course we really want to make sure that those connections to those businesses making business decisions regarding invasive species are recognized. So I would love, Emily, if you would come on. Emily is another Grand Traverse Conservation District employee, and she has volunteered to help us out with questions today.
Hi there.
If we can have, hello, if we can have Kama and Reb and Maddie join us as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, if folks have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll kind of moderate that and ask the panel here. We also have a group that's not so large that if people want to maybe even raise their hands on here, we can go that route. And I'll try and pay attention to when that happens. So if you have any questions, now is the time.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Okay. We are wondering if we over-ordered seedlings. I think we probably have 150 to 200 seedlings coming. Is that something we could do within a week or so, or not sure? Did we overdo it?
It's just us and we're old.
Yeah, it's us and we're old. Yeah.
Reb, do you want to hit that one?
I think that that's a pretty reasonable amount, especially across a week. If if the digging is relatively easy, I mean, that's most of the labor is just getting that hole dug. If it's not too soddy or not too rooty from nearby other woody plant root systems, and the holes are pretty easy to dig, I would say that it's a possibly ambitious, but I don't. I think you have it, Steve. I think you can do it.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I add too, Steve, that this is a perfect situation where I would do some work a week or two in advance, as long as you can get out there and, get rid of the competing vegetation, because that does take quite a bit of time with 200 plants. If you can spread that out, your back will be thankful, I think. So.
Thank you. We have probably 3 sites that we are looking at. 2 are former oil well sites, and
35 years old.
35 years old that really haven't repopulated well. And we have a former dump site. So we are pretty sandy, and we've ordered, and I've forgotten what quantities. I know how much money we spent, but we have some red maples coming, some shagbark hickory, white oak, sugar maple, and sassafras, and we're upland, not wetlands. So I wish we had this before the seedling sale. I would have been better educated, but and I would have probably ordered less, but
This is a great session.
yeah, it's wonderful. So thank you.
We're planning to do it earlier next year. The other thing I would say, in addition to what Kim and Reb said, is that remember that you don't have to do it all in one day. If you wrap those roots back up tight and keep them moist, you know, do a couple, you know, 20 one day and take a rest. You know, don't kill yourselves. You can do it the next day, and then okay, the next day do another 20,
Right.
and it'll be all right. Just maybe remember to wrap up the roots.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, Steve and Carol, this is Katie. I suspect that there are people in your neighborhood who would jump in and participate and do that with you.
I think so.
Thank you.
Reb is already intimately involved, knowledgeable about our dump.
I am familiar with those sites, and you know, if you find that you need to get some remaining portion of them in the ground faster, the Conservation District does have some of those planting bars I mentioned that are available to be lent out to the public, and that would be, and knowing those soils out there, that you know, that would be a real quick, easy way to get them into the ground too.
Thank you. Thanks, Reb.
Okay, we do have a question in the chat. Will sugar maple and shagbark hickory seedlings grow well in the plant tubes? And will the seedlings grow out of the plant tubes in the first summer?
So the answer to the first question is yes, absolutely. And those plant tubes, those tree chips are a great way to get them to grow up high faster. Will they grow out of the plant tubes in the first summer? Almost certainly not. I will say I have had a couple of sites where it's happened, but they were in extremely beautiful, rich, gorgeous soil with just the right amount of water and sunlight, and everything perfect happened. So like, I also think that there might be like magic potion in that soil. Like I was shocked at how it went. So most of the time it's going to take 2, 3, maybe even a couple more years if you know, shagbark hickory in particular is a little bit slow growing. Kama and Maddie, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I would say, especially with the shagbark hickory, you know, it's one of those trees with a really big taproot. And so in those kind of early formative years, it's putting a lot of energy down into the ground first. So it's not going to show much vertical progress for a while, and definitely wouldn't expect it to grow out of the tube.
All right. We have a couple questions. One's actually invasive species related. So there's a question, it doesn't have to be addressed right now, but there's an inquiry about how to remove and replace a big installation of invasive honeysuckle. So maybe I'll just, you know, I technically could answer this, but since Katie's leaving, so I'll defer to Katie. And maybe focus on what could be good replacement options and then where to go. And I mean, essentially she could contact you, Katie, for more information on the invasive side. But basically, should a little at a time be removed or just replace all at once, that sort of thing?
Well, yeah, I would love to have a more in-depth conversation with you about this because every site is different. But honestly, both of those methods, both a little bit at a time and just go juice and murder them all, are both really effective. And it just kind of depends on your site goals and how much time and or money you have. And so the best way is to start and planting native species on top of where there used to be invasive species is super crucial, because there will be seedlings from those invasive species afterwards, and you can help crowd them out and shade them out. So again, please, here's my contact information on the screen. Please do contact me, and I would be delighted to get more in depth with you about invasive species.
Thanks, Katie. There's another question asking if anyone's familiar with regal moth caterpillars, whether they've ever been found on American hazelnut. Is anyone familiar with that at all?
I am not an entomologist.
This might not be quite the right crowd for butterflies and moths questions, unfortunately. Probably MSU Extension maybe would be a good resource for that. Do they have experts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. MSU Extension. I know up here, Nate, oh my gosh, Nate Walton, he is an
Hmm.
entomologist. And so he is a fantastic resource for that.
Is Duke Elsner still with our local MSU Extension?
He's retired, but he is still around.
Cool. That's the only questions from the chat. Is there any additional ones? I know we're just about to wrap up as well.
I also want to shout out Maddie added her, I didn't have her email on the slide here and I apologize. But I wasn't sure that she would be okay with me sharing it and I didn't have a chance to ask her. But she did put it into the chat. So if anyone would like to contact Maddie, that would be great. She's incredibly knowledgeable.
Okay, I think we're good on questions. Oh, Nate Walton's email, Kama just added that into the chat. A good one to ask about the moss and the hickory connection.
I did just do a quick Google to my favorite resource for faunal associations, Illinois wildflowers. And I did not see that particular moth on the list, but that is not the be all end all. That's just my go-to source. So Nate or Duke are definitely going to have more information on that.
Okay, I think we're all set, Katie.
Awesome. Well, big thanks to everybody for joining us. Again, we're here to serve you. So if you have questions, that's genuinely what our jobs are. We would love to help you get the answers you need, whether we can answer them or if we connect you with somebody else.